Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to see everybody. Friends, I'm Joan of Arc Chapel. I'm the director of the Institute for Church Life. And the Institute for Church Life hosts a series on football Saturdays in the fall. Well, of course, there's only football in the fall. Friends, if you've come to one of these already, you know that I'm kind of attached to this idea of Saturdays with the saints, because the ancient Saturday, of course, is the ancient Sabbath. And in Jewish and Christian theology, the idea of the eschaton, the life to come, is imaged by the Sabbath as an eternal Sabbath. So in many ways, we really will be spending Saturdays with the saints in eternity. And so this is kind of a foretaste, you might say, of our eternal Sabbath with the saints, Saturdays with the saints. And anyway, who are the saints? The saints are those who stretch our imagination. They interpret the mystery of the faith with the medium of their lives. Friends, the saints emerge from the life of the church, but they don't belong to the church alone. The saints are for everyone. They're for all people. And how could it be otherwise? Because the image they bear of the Lord, He was the compassion and the strength of God made incarnate for all men and women. The saints, by their witness to His love and compassion, allow us to see that love and compassion anew. They are like lights in the world, as Pope Benedict has recently written, meant to help us imagine our own way into the hope and the love to which they have borne witness. Against temptations of darkness and despair and contempt that can sometimes seem so powerful in the world. Devotion to the saints can be a way of inviting their witness to bear an imprint on our own souls. Our friendship with the saints forges also out of our own lives, too, a witness and a light, however dim or feeble compared to theirs. Blessed be the most holy Trinity. Blessed be God and His angels and His saints. Friends, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker for this morning. Sister Anne Astell is a friend of the saints. She's a Schoenstatt sister of St. Mary. And I see we have two Schoenstatt sisters visiting this morning. She's professor of theology here at the University of Notre Dame. Friends, if the saints are those who cause the light of God to enter the world, then Sister Anne has channeled a lot of that light through her teaching and her scholarship. She is the author of 6 books, and many of them hinge on the ideas of holiness, of sanctity, and of their basis in a theology of the Eucharistic body of Christ. Most especially for today's talk, we can note her monograph from 2003, Joan of Arc and Sacrificial Authorship. Sister Anne is also the editor or co-editor of 5 book-length volumes on topics related to the history of Christian spirituality, including another book very relevant for today, Lay Sanctity, Medieval and Modern, A Search for Models in the year 2000, and also Joan of Arc and Spirituality in the year 2003. I do have a copy of that.
Okay.
Her monograph, Eating Beauty, the Eucharist and the Spiritual Arts of the Middle Ages, offers to the reader a theory of holiness as a form of beauty, the truest form of beauty as revealed in the Eucharistic mediation of the love of God. Please join me in welcoming Sister Anne Astell to the podium for her talk entitled Joan of Arc at the University, God, Country, and Navigation.
Thank you, John, for that introduction and for this series, which has been a blessing to all of us for the last 3 years. It's been a great thing to gather with the saints on Saturdays. 2012 marks the 600th birthday of Joan of Arc, a saint who lives forever in the human imagination as a young girl, a battle leader, and a martyr. Her story is well documented and well known. Let us pause for a moment first to remember it as historians and biographers tell it. In the year 1412, perhaps on January 6th, the feast of the Epiphany, as a late 15th century source reports, Jeanne d'Arc was born to her parents Isabella and Jacques and baptized in the church of Domremy in the Lorraine, a region in the northeast of France. Jeanne had 3 older brothers and a younger sister, Catherine, who preceded her in death. A pious child, Jeanne began to hear voices of instruction during her 13th year. According to her own testimony, she kept these experiences secret for 5 years. Then, in 1428 and 1429, with the somewhat reluctant help of her uncle, Jeanne petitioned Robert de Baudricourt, the commander at Vaucouleurs, to supply her with a horse, an armed escort, and authorization for an audience with the Dauphin, Charles VII. The girl insisted that God had chosen her as his instrument to lead the armies of France to victory over the English invaders and to secure Charles' ascendance to the throne. Accompanied by a few volunteers and dressed in the clothes of a soldier, Jeanne made a dangerous 11-day journey on horseback through enemy territory from Vaucouleurs to Chinon in the Loire Valley, where the Dauphin held his court. Her arrival there on March 4th, 1429, was hailed by some as the fulfillment of a prophecy that France would be saved through a virgin. Jeanne won the personal confidence of Charles through her disclosing to him of a secret, the contents of which remain a secret to us. The Dauphin arranged for an ecclesiastical examination of the Maid at Poitiers by reputed theologians who concluded that Jeanne was a pious girl of good character and who accepted as a conditional sign of her vocation the victory she promised would be won at Orléans, a city long held under English siege. At Poitiers, Jeanne dictated the first of her letters, an ultimatum to the King of England, demanding the withdrawal of his troops from French soil. Equipped with symbolic accoutrements, a miraculously discovered sword, white armor, a ring, a standard, and a pennon, Jeanne joined the royal army on its way to Orléans and entered the city on April 29, 1429. Galvanized by the presence of the Maid, La Pucelle, who exhorted them to prayer and penance, the French troops stormed the English fortresses surrounding the city and took them one by one until the battle ended in English defeat on May 8th. The victory at Orléans was followed by a rapid succession of victories, the most famous of which occurred at Patay, where the English general John Talbot was captured. City after city yielded to the Maid, who wept over the dead and wounded, English and French alike, and who called repeatedly for the peaceful submission to Charles. The way opened up for the Dauphin to proceed to Reims, where he was anointed and crowned king by the presiding archbishop on July 17, 1429. His succession to the throne secured, Charles began to vacillate in his support of Jeanne's martial efforts for a complete expulsion of the English army from France. In September, he commanded the cessation of the attack on Paris and the disbanding of the army. Restless at court in the winter of 1429 and the spring of 1430, Jean still persisted in occasional military expeditions, but with mixed results. Captured at Compiègne on May 23rd, Jean was held prisoner by her Burgundian captor, Jean of Luxembourg, in a high tower at Beaurevoir, from which he attempted to escape. In November, Jean accepted a valuable payment for her from the English, who had imposed a tax on the people of Normandy for that purpose. Charles VII made no offer, either of a ransom or of a prisoner exchange for the Maid, whom he effectively abandoned. Jean arrived at Rouen on December 23, 1430. Her trial began on January 9, 1431. Chained and guarded by English soldiers day and night, Jean was tried by an ecclesiastical court, over which Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, presided. Through relentless interrogation, sleep deprivation, threatened torture, and violations of the seal of confession, her judges sought to validate charges of heresy, immorality, sedition, idolatry, and witchcraft. Jean's voices counseled her to answer boldly. They spoke to her of a martyrdom and a great victory. Facing death at the stake, an exhausted Jean publicly signed on May 24th a document abjuring her voices. She expected to be transferred to a church prison and to be allowed to receive the Eucharist. Instead, she was taken back to the English prison, where she was maltreated, probably raped. She resumed, perhaps of necessity, the wearing of male clothes, thus incurring the charge of a relapse into heresy. On May 28th, she declared that she had been wrong to deny her voices by signing the abjuration. On May 30th, 1431, after receiving the Eucharist devoutly in her prison cell, Jean was publicly burned at the stake in the presence of a large crowd, including an estimated 800 English soldiers and several dignitaries, including the Earl of Warwick. She was heard to forgive her enemies and to ask forgiveness for her own sins. Fixing her gaze upon a cross, she died crying aloud the name Jesus. An Anglo-Burgundian soldier declared, "We have burned a saint." Five centuries later, on May 9th, 1920, the Church officially concurred in that soldier's judgment when Pope Benedict XV canonized Jeanne d'Arc, a saint in the ranks of the Holy Virgins, partly on the basis of an official inquest held between 1449 and 1456, which preserves the testimonies of 115 witnesses and provides considerable evidence of her heroic virtue. On July 7th, 1456, a panel of judges in Paris nullified the results of the trial for heresy held against Jeanne d'Arc at Rouen and rehabilitated her. Tested by 4 trials at Poitiers, at Rouen, at Paris, and finally in Rome, the girl from medieval Domremy has emerged from the crucible of history as a canonized saint who stands among the greatest and most popular saints of modern times. Much can be said about St. Joan. In what follows, I use the title of my lecture as an outline, first to talk about her presence at the university in general terms, then to use her particular instantiation here at the University of Notre Dame to suggest that Joan has a great deal to teach us today about how to love God and God's church, our country, and Our Lady. thinking in the spiritual company of St. Joan about how to love God, country, and Notre Dame can help us to discover what is most essential to her sanctity and to our imitation of her, namely, that which the French poet, playwright, and political mystic Charles Péguy has called the mystery of the charity of Joan of Arc. Her all-conquering love in the face of hardest disappointment, betrayal, and abandonment. Joan of Arc at the university. To think of Joan of Arc at the university is a curious thing. Jeanne d'Arc learned to spell her own name, that's her signature, but that was probably the limit of her literacy. Schooled by her mother, she had memorized the Ave Maria, the Pater Noster, and the Creed. But her formal religious education was that typical for a pious laywoman in a small French village. No match for that of the judges and university-trained theologians who questioned her, tried her cases, and wrote the documents that were involved in her process. Jeanne d'Arc would never have been admitted to any university in her own time, nor would she gain admission into one today, were she a time traveler to apply. Coming from Domremy would not give her an automatic home under the dome. And yet, were Joan of Arc to return to earth in a physical form and to slip into a seat in the back row of a university classroom, she would be astonished and probably often dismayed to find herself the topic of discussion in many a course in the humanities. Attending a film class, would Joan be able to recognize herself in the performances of Renée Falconetti? This film was shown on campus, I think, 2 weeks ago. Ingrid Bergman? Jean Seberg. At the Performing Arts Center, imagine a time-traveling Joan as she encounters herself on the stage, perhaps singing in the 1938 oratorio composed by Paul Claudel and Arthur Honegger, or defending herself as a heroine in Lillian Hellman's Broadway adaptation, The Lark. Listening in on a gender studies class, St. Joan might hear herself described variously as a transvestite, an androgyne, or a proto-feminist, as George Bernard Shaw believed her to be. In a history class, she might overhear a debate about whether or not she actually exercised any military leadership in the 100 Years' War, about her putative influence over England's future queens, Margaret of Anjou and the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I, about the role her image played in propaganda during the French Revolution and the First and Second World Wars, about her pivotal role, according to historian Jules Michelet, in concluding the Middle Ages and giving birth to the modern nation state. In a medieval studies class, she might find students translating 15th century documents related to Joan, especially her trial records, worrying about violations of canon law, comparing her case to that of others tried for heresy. Auditing an English literature class, Joan might hear students discussing Shaw's play, St. Joan, or Mark Twain's Joan of Arc, or even a lyric about her by Leonard Cohen. Were Joan to attend a class in comparative literature, she might find the students reading Friedrich Schiller's Maid of Orléans, or Bertolt Brecht's St. Joan of the Stockyards, or the poem written about her by the French medieval poet Christine de Pizan. walking with art history students to a museum, she might be very surprised to find herself depicted in paintings by Jules Bastien-Lepage and Paul Gauguin, among others. In a philosophy class, she might find her name written in Simone Weil's book, Need for Roots, or read it in a study by Jacques Maritain. In a political science class, Joan might learn that she is regularly enlisted in the service of different political agendas, from the far right to the far left, especially in modern France. And what about theology? Joan might find her example invoked in a class on miracles, in a discussion of the laws for the discernment of spirits, in a study of just war theory and pacifism, in a class on the meaning of private revelation, on the theology of history, on Carmelite spirituality, given the little flower's great love for her. There you see St. Therese playing Joan of Arc in a convent play. Or a course on ecclesial movements, such as Schoenstatt. Or even in a course on the Church's developing theology of Judaism. I hope I've made my point that Joan of Arc is a saint that has made us think, and who continues to make us think. From that perspective, the Maid from Domremy has a guaranteed place under the dome. I drew the main title of my talk, Joan of Arc at the University, from the title of a collection of essays edited by Mary Elizabeth Tallon and published in 1997 by Marquette University Press. We've been holding up books. This is the one. Marquette University, my alma mater as an MA student, boasts the possession of the Joan of Arc Chapel, a chapel carried stone by stone from France to Long Island in 1927, reconstructed first there and then in 1966 in Milwaukee. The oldest part of the chapel dates from St. Joan's own lifetime, and there are legends associated with it that she perhaps prayed in that chapel. Joan of Arc is certainly present at Marquette University. She's also here with us, visibly at Notre Dame. Her image appears in a relief carving above and to the left of the side entrance to the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. St. Michael, identified as one of St. Joan's voices, along with St. Catherine of Alexandria and St. Margaret. It's little known, but St. Gabriel also spoke to Joan of Arc, appears in relief on the other side. So you've got Joan of Arc and Michael. Across the entrance appears the words, God, country, and Notre Dame. Now, I'm not going to show much pictures for the rest, so I really want you to listen to this. God. There can be no doubt that Joan of Arc loved God. Words fail when one tries to describe a love like hers. But let me use three adjectives: sacramental, obedient unto death, and triumphant over scandal. Joan was an extraordinarily sacramental saint. She took care that army chaplains heard the confessions of her soldiers, and she herself confessed daily on the battlefield, not unlike Dorothy Day, who confessed weekly to keep her soul squeaky clean, and who humbly counted on it that failures would and did occur in the thick of life's battle. In an age when frequent communion was unusual, Joan attended Holy Mass regularly and with great devotion, daily whenever possible. During the months of her excruciating imprisonment, Joan not only confessed frequently, but she also pleaded again and again to receive the Eucharist, a reception that was denied to her as an accused heretic, and then inexplicably granted to her as a food of martyrs on the very morning of her execution as a relapsed heretic. Joan's profound sense of the Church's sacraments as an outward sign communicating the grace of Christ was consistent with her appreciation more broadly of sacramentals. The ringing of church bells, in which she sometimes heard her voices, the ring on her finger inscribed with 3 crosses and the names of Jesus and Mary, the holy names, Jesus, Maria, with which she began her dictated letters, the pennon depicting the scene of the Annunciation, the fleur-de-lis as an emblem of purity and faith. Joan's own body was given to God and others as a sacramental, her virginity as a sign and source of spiritual integrity, her ears to hear God's call in her voices and in the cries of her people, her mouth to speak God's prophecies, her eyes to look with faith and to see unseen realities, her body at the stake mirroring the image of the crucifix at which she fixed her gaze. The parallels between the trial and death of Joan and Jesus are often noted. In his multi-volume History of France, the great 19th century historian Jules Michelet, for example, likens Joan's jury to the Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus, the presiding bishop of Beauvais to the high priest Caiaphas, the collusion of the Norman and Burgundian clergy with the English occupiers with that of the Jewish leaders and the Romans. Acknowledging the power of that comparison and turning it against Michelet's anti-Judaism, the modern Jewish scholar Jules Isaac argues in his book, The Teaching of Contempt, that just as no one would hold Christians as a whole responsible for the death of St. Joan, no one should blame the whole Jewish people, past and present, for the death of Jesus. An argument, by the way, that was among those that influenced the Church's firm rejection at Vatican Council II of the doctrine of deicide as erroneous. Jules Isaac had a private audience with Pope John the 23rd, gave him a copy of that book. When Carl Theodor Dreyer's classic 1928 silent movie, The Passion of Joan of Arc, was first shown in theaters in France, an initial reaction deemed that work to be anti-clerical in spirit, due in part to its depiction of Joan's persecutors in close-up shots of their faces, unadorned by makeup, ugly, toothless, warty, old. In today's theaters and concert halls, where Dreyer's cinematic masterpiece is shown accompanied by Richard Einhorn's musical composition, Voices of Light, that anti-clerical potential remains, not so much because of the film itself, which centers luminously on the saint herself, and which also shows us some clergymen, walking away from that trial, but because of the recent clergy scandals, terrible in themselves, costly to the Church, taken up relentlessly by the media. Joan's clergy scandal is relevant to ours. Joan's love for God, was it not tested and scandalized by the cruelty, the bias, and the actual illegality of the process taken against her by a jury consisting of priests and abbots and presided over by a bishop? In this regard, in the current clergy scandal, St. Joan of Arc has much to teach us. She knew well, and she declared that the political bias of her judges, English allies all, made them unfit to judge her. She appealed to have her case heard instead by the council held at Basel or by the Pope. an appeal that should immediately have suspended the trial at Rouen. She referred also to her judges to the positive ruling given at Poitiers. She said, look at the book at Poitiers. She called on God as her judge. She maintained to the end her faithfulness to God and to the church, and she rightly resisted her judge's claim to speak on behalf of the church. May we all have such faith, such a power as Joan's, to distinguish between the earthly failures of individual Christians and the holiness of the church as Christ's bride. And may we be granted a charity such as hers, which finally forgave her judges and her executioners. Country. St. Joan loved her country and her king, but she was not a nationalist, nor was she a partisan in French politics. She simply loved France as a homeland, its native soil, its regional features, its rivers, forests, fields, and towns. She loved her countrymen and women, the languages and dialects they spoke, the customs and traditions, the specific qualities of character that are distinctively French. She understood that the English, too, have a homeland, families, homes, villages, a language, a character that's distinctive and dear and precious to God. She had no animus against immigrants. Her quarrel was with an invading army that had wreaked havoc for decades on the people of her homeland, killing, raping, and taxing their fellow human beings and fellow Christians. Her solution? The peaceful withdrawal of the English in the name of God. Joan's tears over the wounded and the dead and her comfort of the dying, English and French alike, indicate clearly that she took no delight in war. She told her chaplain, "If I am to die soon, tell the King our liege from me that he must establish chapels for people to pray for the souls of those who died in the defense of the kingdom." St. Joan served her country well, recalling her people to their high ideals, inspiring their hope, and giving them a king anointed to their service. Writing during Joan's own lifetime, Christine de Bazan attested, in 1429 the sun began to shine again. Things have changed from great sorrow to new joy. You, blessed Maid, undid the rope that held France tightly bound. Blessed be God who created you. And yet, as we have seen, Charles VII withdrew his support from her after his coronation, made no attempt to ransom her as a prisoner of war, sent no forces to rescue her, requested no exchange of prisoners. She might well have been tempted to turn against her king, but she strictly guarded his secrets under enemy interrogation, prayed for him, and maintained her loyalty to him as king and her hope in the completion of his kingdom until the end. Meditating on Joan of Arc in London in 1943, Simone Weil found in her example an answer to the question, how is one to love one's country? The French nation had made no resistance to the invading German forces in 1940, choosing instead to give the North into the control of the occupying forces. In Weil's analysis, the modern nation-state had betrayed France as a country, a homeland. In June 1940, writes Weil, one saw how hideous and pitiful could be the spectacle of a people no longer attached by bonds of fidelity to anything whatsoever. St. Joan, by contrast, had loved her country with a compassion moved by her people's suffering, a suffering caused both by France's enemies and by its own sins and failings, its self-divisions. Because her heart belonged first of all to God, St. Joan did not make the mistake of an idolatrous nationalism. Her patriotism was a Christian virtue. She loved her country for the sake of God, her homeland as a means to achieve the eternal homeland. As Vey writes, we should beware of applying the same rules to the welfare of the state as to that of the soul. A Christian ought to be able to draw the conclusion the welfare of the state is a cause to which only a limited and conditional loyalty is owed, unquote. In this election year, in an era where religious liberty is everywhere increasingly an issue, where political scandals abound, and when people can easily feel betrayed by our elected representatives, both parties, St. Joan may teach us much about how to love our country, its leaders, its men and women in the military. She has something to say both to soldiers like my brother, who wore a Medal of St. Joan during his tour of duty as a CB photographer in Iraq, and to pacifists like Dorothy Day, who was devoted to the saint for her unflinching obedience to the voices of conscience, and to Joan as a fellow prisoner. Notre Dame. This last title of St. Joan's love, her charity, might surprise some of you. Some years ago, when I told a colleague that I was writing an essay on St. Joan's devotion to the Virgin Mary, he replied, "What can that virago have to do with a humble handmaid of the Lord?" His half-joking response corresponded to what I found in my research, namely a tendency, especially on the part of Protestant and some feminist commentators, simply to ignore St. Joan's historically well-documented devotion to the Virgin Mary. The testimonies given by 11 witnesses during the rehabilitation inquest in 1456 recall Joan's particular attachment to Notre Dame de Bremont, a hermitage near Domremy, where Joan and her friends often used to go to pray, to bring flowers, to burn candles, especially on Saturdays, before a simple statue of the Madonna. In Joan's dictated letters, she honored the names of Mary linked to that of Jesus. She commanded the army chaplains to lead the troops in singing Marian hymns in camp. She herself was called by others and named herself the Maid, Jeanne la Pucelle, a title that suggests a Marian identification of the young saint with the Virgin Mary in both purity and humility. George Tavard has argued that Pucelle derives from the French word pouce, meaning flea, a wee little thing, a maid in the sense of a handmaid. Joan's voices called her daughter of God, as she told her judges at Rouen. Christians in Joan's own time associated her with the Virgin Mary, whose banner Joan carried into battle. The topic is richly suggestive of 15th century liberation theology, the belief of the downtrodden people that God would send them a Savior in and through the yes to her vocation, the fiat of a humble young virgin. Inspired by the Eva Ave wordplay and by the typological contrast between Eve and Mary as the new Eve, a prophecy current in France and Germany stated that the kingdom that had been lost through a woman would be restored through a virgin. Wounded in the battle at Paris, the last of her battles before the disbanding of the army, Joan left her white armor as an offering at the altar of Mary at the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis. The young saint who called herself the Maid, who renounced marriage and the simple joys of domestic life for the sake of her military vocation, and who wore a soldier's costume as a protection for her purity and as a sign, a habit of her unusual calling. This saint also suffered greatly for her striving to live as a Mary in a man's world. Like the Virgin Mary, whose virginity before, during, and after Jesus' birth was doubted, Joan of Arc had to endure repeated, humiliating physical examinations to test her physical purity, in part because it was believed that no evil spirit could possess a virgin. From the English, she had to endure terrible name-calling, the accusation of whoredom, called her a witch. In her prison cell at Rouen, she had to defend herself against physical abuse by the men who guarded her. The evidence is unclear, but a weeping Joan is said to have told her confessor that she had been raped on the night before her death. One would have liked to have seen Joan of Arc canonized as a martyr, because the Christ-like manner of her death bore witness to the Jesus she loved. One would have liked to see her canonized as a confessor, for the witness she bears to the sacrament of confession. But it is fitting that Joan was canonized in 1920 victoriously as a virgin, in keeping with the name she chose for herself, La Pucelle, as a tribute to her love for Notre Dame, and as a sign of the Church's belief from the time of St. Augustine that no violence against a woman, no rape, can destroy a person's purity, rob them of their spiritual virginity and personal dignity. Here at Notre Dame, that name refers both to Our Lady herself, honored in chapels throughout campus, but especially in the Lourdes Grotto. And it refers, secondly, to the university itself. Let us hope that we can all learn from St. Joan's love for Mary, that such a love, which humbles us, which makes us aware of our nothingness and weakness, also makes us pure and strong in the service of others. God, country, Notre Dame.
Brethren, we have some time for questions. So the floor is open.
Yes.
What was the historical reason why Charles abandoned her?
It may, I mean, we don't really know the answer to that question. There's a lot of speculation about it. There were three forces involved. There were the English, there were the Burgundians, and then there were the French. Right? And what made a difference was when the English started to have troubles back home, the War of the Roses, right, which divided their strength. And then there was also a new alliance, a reconciliation that Joan had actually started in motion. And when that alliance was formed between Charles and I can't remember the name of the other player, then he began to take action. And so it's actually true that the English were out of France by the time that at the utmost limit of the time that she had prophesied. So, but it happened in a way that people probably didn't expect, through the trouble back home on the English side. It could be that Charles just thought, he thought his chances weren't good, and he didn't have the same faith that she did. He was willing to accept money from the Burgundians, which meant that he couldn't fight them. So, yeah. Yes.
Could you speak to the process of her canonization? In other words, after the rehabilitation, why did it take until 1920 to declare her a saint? I mean, what were the steps in between?
Yeah. It's a great question. Okay, so we get to the end of the 15th century. She's been rehabilitated. Then, it takes a while until the English are out, all right? And then there's the French Revolution, right? Okay, which was a very hard time for the church, right? To get, for any kind of traction for a French saint during that time would have been pretty much impossible. And then you had the strong anti-clericalism in the early 18th century, and then when the restoration of the monarchy occurred, all right, then you saw the people on the Royalist Party, started to, there was one of these wonderful paintings in 19th century France showing her. And Marie d'Orléans, the daughter of the king, was also an artist and sculpted the famous statue. This is the cover this book has it on, a sculpture of Joan of Arc at prayer, where she's looking down at her sword with the hilt of the sword, and it doubles as a cross. So it's a wonderful. It's to find the medium ground between depicting Joan as a kind of a Lady Liberty, used by the left and the rebels, and a sort of pro-royalist party that weren't really interested in her piety. But that image seemed to galvanize a force, right? And the church was stronger at that point in the 19th century. The government was more tolerant of Catholics, so they started to move the process. But meanwhile, the church would be reluctant to canonize a saint involved so strongly in political and military life, right, if the English weren't on board, okay? And so it's a fascinating story because Voltaire, right, wrote a terrible satire about Joan of Arc. And Friedrich Schiller was so scandalized by this work by Voltaire that he wrote this wonderful Maid of Orléans, right? And then it's like the gauntlet was thrown down. Okay, so then everybody wanted to defend Joan of Arc, including the English. So Robert Southey, at the beginning of the Romantic movement, wrote an epic about Joan of Arc. He was kind of a Jacobin, a pro-Jacobin Englishman. But he got Samuel Coleridge to involve himself in it. And he kept revising it. And so the English started to celebrate Joan as a heroine, right? And now her statue's in Westminster Cathedral in England. And one of the things they did when the trial for the actual process of canonization got to Rome, they consulted with the Queen of England, or the king, I'm not sure who was on the throne at that time, probably a king, and said, well, would you have any objections? And the answer was none whatsoever, right? And so you have a saint that led the French against the English, and you have the English actually, through their works of art in many ways, leading the French to reclaim and notice the holiness of this woman. And so we owe a lot to the English, for her process of canonization. And then the process was interesting because, there was no living witnesses anymore, because so they have to go back to this inquest. And Andy Kelly at UCLA, he's a canon lawyer and a medievalist there. He's got an essay on the canonization process in this book, but the Devil's Advocate went over kind of all the same ground, right? But they were able to come up with good answers, right, to lead it forward. Like, for instance, she tried to escape from that tower, and it was a very high tower. She tied sheets together and let herself out of a window and then just dropped, right? It was a very long fall. She was knocked unconscious. She could have been killed. That's what we would normally have expected, right? So then the Devil's Advocate asked, well, was this a suicide attempt? Was she doing this out of despair? Right? And her answer was, and then she was questioned during the trial at Rouen, why did you try to escape? And she said, well, it's the duty of a prisoner of war to try to escape. And she tied those sheets together. I mean, if she was trying to commit suicide, she just would have, thrown herself off, right? So, all of those questions, they just worked them all, their way through them again. Yes?
Why was she not canonized as a martyr? And was the fact that it was done at the hands of the church have anything to do with that?
Okay. Well, historians of sanctity, all right, will note that the category of martyr had been restricted to martyrs for the faith, right? And it was only in the case of Maria Goretti that she's the first case where a person was canonized as a martyr for virtue, right? In her case, it was purity. And then Maximilian Kolbe has been canonized as a martyr of charity. But when Joan's case came forward, there was no precedent, for canonizing someone as a martyr for the faith, which was the only way they understood the category at that time. And I think I would have argued for it, right? Because if you look at what it means to be a martyr for the faith, it can take two forms. It could be, if someone is defending an article of the creed, right? If that's at issue, and you're willing to give your life rather than worship a false god, that's clearly you're a martyr for the faith, right? But there's another sense in which it can be understood. If the manner of a person's death is Christ-like, right, then the death itself is a witness in the sense of a martyrdom, right? And so, I think this is a case where the church may revisit this and give her some more titles. Because she's been canonized as a virgin does not mean that she could not be canonized, as a martyr. But you're right; it's tricky, that she was condemned by an ecclesiastical jury. There's other problems with the legality of this trial. Sentence was not pronounced on her before she was handed over to the bailiff, right? There's all kinds of violations of canon law took place in that trial. So unlike George Bernard Shaw, who says that people were acting in good faith and they were following the rules, it really wasn't the case. I think that the trial lasted as long as it did, all right, months, all right, because the eyes of the world were on that trial. It was, people were watching, and they didn't want to do anything that would appear to the outside world, as wrong. So they, followed through. How do I spell my name? Oh. Okay, I think I can remember. It's Astell. Yeah.
And who, besides St. Joan, who are a couple of other of your favorite saints?
Well, I love the Blessed Mother too, and so St. Mary, and St. Bernadette is one of my favorites, and I like St. Bernard of Clairvaux for different reasons. Edith Stein. Yes, and St. Michael. It's interesting. If you have kind of a devotion to saints, how at different points in your life you start to have a relationship to a different one, a new one. And certain circumstances will trigger it. All of a sudden you make a connection that you didn't have before. But yeah. Yes.
With the canonization of her in 1920, in the aftermath of the First World War, many hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen killed and many others grievously wounded. And is it a consolation to all the young French women who were left to lead a life of heroic virtue in the absence of suitable mates?
That's a really, I've never thought of it that way, but that really could be. And there were other things going on that made the canonization at just that moment propitious. For instance, there was a kind of a movement toward frequent communion and early communion. And so if you go to Domremy, they have murals on the wall with all different scenes of Joan's life. And they have a large, beautiful mural showing Joan of Arc's first communion, with the different village girls when they're wearing their bridal gowns, receiving the Eucharist for the first time. And there's no mention of her first communion, in any of the records. We know she had one, but it was a way of, picking her up, as an example at a time when people wanted an example,
And we have time for one more question.
I find it compelling how many different areas or types of people were drawn to Joan. I'm particularly myself drawn to her attention to the primacy of conscience.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what that means for us today in the church, and where we need to be more aware of what's happening in the church today around that, and particularly thinking of the role of women in the church.
Mm-hmm.
Feel called to a fuller role, and how you might, speak to that. You think that's something that's applicable as seeing Joan as a role model?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, when Dorothy Day, she had a statue of Joan on her shelf, and Joan was, and Dorothy, of course, was a very committed, absolute pacifist. And someone said, well, isn't that a little strange? Isn't that a contradiction that you're so attached to Joan of Arc? and the question actually puzzled Dorothy. And she said, well, she wasn't canonized for leading armies. She was canonized for following her conscience. Right? But a conscience really motivated by love of God, right? It's the love of God that illumines our conscience, and makes us, I think that's important to keep in mind. That the love of God, the love of our neighbor, our conscience has to be illumined, and then we won't go wrong.